Right now, somewhere in an airport terminal, you're sitting in a chair that reclines, holding a coffee that costs $6, waiting to be transported 3,000 miles through the air in about 5 hours. You'll land somewhere you've never been, collect your bag, and be mildly annoyed if the taxi takes more than 10 minutes. Your ancestors did the same thing. They crossed the same distances, reached the same continents. They just did it without knowing where they were going, without any way of knowing if the journey would end, and with their children on their backs and everything they owned in their hands. And here's what nobody tells you. They shouldn't have made it, not remotely, by every calculation of what a fragile, slow, barely clothed primate can endure. The journeys your ancestors completed are among the most extraordinary things any creature has ever done on this planet. So how did they actually travel? Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers will reset your understanding of everything else. The earliest modern humans evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago. By 70,000 years ago, the first groups began moving out of the continent. By 45,000 years ago, humans had reached Australia, which required crossing 90 kilometers of open ocean with no land in sight. In boats they built themselves by hand. By 15,000 years ago, humans had walked into the Americas, having crossed a frozen land bridge from Siberia in temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees. By roughly 1,000 years ago, Polynesian navigators were crossing the open Pacific, the largest and deepest ocean on Earth, landing on islands smaller than a modern town. No maps, no compasses, no GPS. No way of calling for help if something went wrong. The whole story of human migration is, at its core, a story about what happens when curiosity is stronger than fear. But before the Great Migrations, before the ocean crossings and the frozen continents, travel looked much more ordinary and much harder. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups have found a remarkably consistent pattern across wildly different environments. The Hadza in Tanzania, the Aboriginal Australians before colonization, the indigenous groups of the Amazon, all of them moved. Not randomly, not desperately, but in deliberate seasonal circuits. They followed the food. When the rains came and the tubers grew in the eastern valleys, they moved east. When the dry season drove the herds to the river, they followed the herds to the river. Over a single year, a hunter-gatherer group might cover 200 to 500 kilometers of territory. Not in one journey, but in a slow, continuous reading of the landscape. The land wasn't empty space to be crossed. It was a text to be read, and your ancestors had been reading it for thousands of years. Here's the evidence that makes this concrete. In 2011, researchers studying Aboriginal Australians documented what they called songlines, intricate navigational routes encoded in oral tradition, where specific songs described specific landmarks in the order you would encounter them while traveling. A mountain, then a specific tree, then a water source. The song was the map. Some of these songlines stretched over 1,500 kilometers, passed down through generations for thousands of years, memorized before anyone made their first journey. A young person setting out into unfamiliar territory wasn't walking blind. They were walking to a song their grandmother taught them. Now here's where it gets strange. Because your ancestors weren't just moving across land they knew. At some point, nobody knows exactly when or why, groups of them stood at the edge of the sea, looked out at a horizon with nothing on it, and decided to go anyway. The crossing to Australia is the one that genuinely unsettles researchers, even accounting for every island chain that would have been exposed. The final crossing still required intentional open ocean navigation. You would have needed to carry enough fresh water for multiple days at sea and maintain your course toward something you had never seen and had no guarantee existed. The people who made that crossing left no written record, but they left something else, themselves. Their descendants were in Australia 50,000 years before a single European set foot on that continent. Geneticist Alan Cooper, who spent years studying the DNA of ancient populations, has called the Australia crossing one of the greatest logistical achievements in the history of our species. Not because of the technology involved, which was minimal, but because of what it required cognitively. You had to believe in a destination you couldn't see. You had to trust a plan that couldn't be revised once you were at sea. That kind of reasoning, projecting yourself into an unknown future and acting on it, is one of the things that separates human intelligence from almost every other species on Earth. But the ocean crossings, staggering as they are, aren't the journey that should haunt you the most. The walk into the Americas required crossing what is now the Bering Strait, a land bridge called Beringia that connected Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age, when sea levels were low enough to expose a stretch of land up to 1,000 kilometers wide. It sounds almost easy when you describe it that way. A land bridge, you just walk across it. What that description leaves out is the cold. Beringia wasn't a mild stretch of tundra. It was one of the most hostile environments on Earth, swept by Arctic winds with temperatures that could kill an unprotected human in minutes. The people who crossed it had no Gore-Tex, no synthetic insulation, no emergency shelters. What they had was animal skin, carefully scraped and sewn by hand with needles made from bone, layered in ways that trapped air and held heat. Archaeologists have found some of these needles at sites in Siberia dating back 50,000 years. They are so small and so precisely made that researchers initially mistook them for modern objects. Someone sat down 50,000 years ago and threaded a strand of sinew through an eye the width of a human hair. That needle is what crossed Beringia, not bravery in the abstract. Bravery made physically possible by a hand tool small enough to hold between two fingers. And yet, even the needles and the boats and the songs aren't the real answer to how ancient humans traveled. Those are the technology. The deeper answer is the social architecture underneath them. No ancient journey was a solo expedition. Every major migration in human prehistory involved groups, extended families, whole bands, multiple generations traveling together. The oldest members carried the knowledge of where water sources were, which plants were toxic in this new climate, which animals were dangerous here that weren't dangerous back home. The youngest members were being trained in real time, absorbing the new landscape as they moved through it. Mothers carried infants. When someone was injured, they were carried. A skeleton found in northern Iraq at Shanidar Cave, dating to around 60,000 years ago, belonged to a Neanderthal man who had been blind in one eye, had a withered arm, and was severely arthritic. He lived to roughly 40 years old, a considerable age for that era. He could not have hunted. He could not have carried his own supply. Someone fed him, supported him, moved him when the group moved. The journey kept going because nobody got left behind. This is the thing that separated human migration from animal migration. A herd moves because instinct drives it forward. Humans moved because they made a collective decision, maintained it across years and generations, and took care of whoever couldn't keep pace on their own. So here's where this leaves you. In 5 hours of flight time or a few days of driving, you can cross a distance that took your ancestors' generation. The same landscape they walked across, suffered across, died crossing, you now move through at 500 miles per hour watching a movie. It's genuinely extraordinary, and it's so ordinary that you have forgotten it is extraordinary at all. But the architecture hasn't changed. When you move somewhere new for a job, you call your family. When you get lost in a city, you ask someone who knows it. When the journey gets hard, the people around you are the reason you continue. You are still doing what the person crossing Beringia was doing, still navigating by the knowledge other people gave you, still moving toward a destination you can't fully see, still deciding each time it gets difficult that the horizon is worth it. Your ancestors crossed oceans to get here. They walked through ice to get here. They sang maps they had never tested just to get here. They got here. So will you.